Bennett, and we are recording this session, so everybody should be aware. Please, if you have any objections to that, please let me know now. We're hoping to put this on our YouTube feed later. So welcome to this second of three consultations and workshops on the work of TUFAS over the last couple of years. This is the final workshop for Lot 2, Public and Private Sector Commitment to Food Fortification and Nutrition-Enriched Crops. So what I'm going to do over the next 90 minutes, or what we are going to do over the next 90 minutes, we're going to introduce the team, outline our objectives, and talk about the workshop rules and the workshop objectives. We're going to have a keynote by Christophe Guyondet, who will give us the context of this research in other research activities that are going on with the same program. Then we're going to explain the aims and scope of the work and talk a bit about the method. And then we'll work through some of the findings that we've got from the literature review, key informant survey, telephone interviews, case study findings, and finally we'll try and find a few take-homes messages. If we've got time, we will try and have an engaging discussion at the end. And I hope somebody from the TUFAS team will make some closing remarks. So that's the outline of what we're going to do today. Just to introduce the core team, I'm the handsome gentleman with the tie, fairly obviously, on the right-hand side. Dr. Aurelie Bechoff is also on this call. Dr. Baqir Lalani has done a lot of this work, and he will also be presenting some of this work. And we also want to remember the efforts of Professor Keith Tomlins, who was heavily involved at the beginning of this lengthy process. So that was the core team, and I'll mention the many other people involved later. So what are we trying to achieve today? We are, by the end of this workshop, we are hopeful that you will understand the key findings, how we gathered this data and what it means. And we also hope that you will have a chance to discuss and validate and raise issues that you feel are important. I want to outline the workshop rules. We have translation going on. So if you want to hear this in French, you need to press the button at the bottom of your screen. Which from the other workshops we've done works very well, but what we have to do is to speak clearly and at a reasonable speed to give the translators a chance. Also, if you're asking a technical question, you might need to explain it in more simple words to help them translate it. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a managed chat approach. My colleagues are going to manage the chat as we go along. If you have questions, you want to raise issues, something excites you or something is interesting to you, put it in the chat, and either they answer it straight away, or if it's a really important thing, we will come back to it at the end. So that we have a kind of, we hope to have a constant flow of questions and answers going on in the chat. We'll share all the slides later, and we're recording and we'll put everything on YouTube so you can see it back again. So at this point, I'd like to call Christophe in to give us a background for this work so you can see it in its context. Hi, Christophe.
Merci Ben, je vais prendre l'occasion, on a le luxe d'avoir un traducteur, donc je vais parler en français. And I hope the translation will be working fine. En fait, je voudrais simplement que mon nom est Christophe Guyondet, je suis le team leader de l'équipe TOFAS. TOFAS, pour ceux qui ne connaîtraient pas, nous sommes un consortium de consultants financés par l'Union européenne dont le rôle est d'appuyer les délégations de l'Union européenne dans l'implémentation de programmes de fortification alimentaire. TOFAS existe depuis à peu près 6 ans. Nous avons aidé un certain nombre de pays et de délégations dans l'implémentation de projets pilotes de fortification. Et un des angles d'attaque et des angles de travail sur lesquels nous avons travaillé, c'est effectivement donc ce qu'on a appelé les research lots, qui est un travail qui a commencé il y a 4 ans, en 2018. Next slide, Ben. Next. Merci. Là, donc, TOFAS, c'est un consortium, comme je vous le disais. Donc, nous opérons sous l'égide à la fois donc, de l'Alliance mondiale pour la malnutrition GAIN et London Mills. Et nous sommes déployés donc, à travers le monde pour aider les programmes de fortification. Ce qui nous réunit aujourd'hui, donc c'est ce qu'on a appelé le research lot, le portefeuille en fait de recherche qui consiste à consolider un peu la connaissance que l'on a et de guider un petit peu le planning et l'implémentation des programmes de fortification dans le futur. La fortification, ce n'est pas quelque chose de récent, c'est quelque chose sur lequel énormément d'entre vous travaillent depuis des années, mais on a besoin de consolider cette évidence et de la guider. Et on a appris donc au premier webinaire la semaine dernière qu'il y a certainement des choses que l'on peut améliorer, en particulier on a vu en Afrique de l'Ouest. Donc c'est le deuxième aujourd'hui webinaire qui nous... On a trois, si vous voulez, trois recherches différentes avec 3 équipes différentes, l'équipe de même étant la deuxième. Moi, ce que je voudrais vous donner, c'est un peu l'origine de ces travaux de recherche. Donc, comme je vous disais, prochain slide, l'objectif, next slide, sorry. L'objectif, c'est vraiment de consolider donc l'évidence, la base de connaissances, et on s'est appuyé là-dessus on a essayé d'identifier des questions de recherche. Et on s'est appuyé sur un processus multiple, donc à la fois sur les recommandations du sommet global d'Arusha en 2015, un exercice de global mapping qui a été fait par l'équipe de TOFAS en 2016, et puis un séminaire qui a culminé tout ça sur un séminaire en mars 2018. Comme je vous disais, ça fait à peu près donc 4 ans, next slide, que l'on travaille pour qu'on a identifié donc les thèmes de recherche. Et next slide, Ben, please. Donc ce processus itératif qui a commencé en 2016 a culminé en 2018 par la mise en place de termes de référence et la sélection de 4 thèmes de recherche clés. Donc le thème numéro 1, c'est vraiment comprendre les différentes stratégies, donc la combinaison de stratégies dans le combat contre la malnutrition. Le deuxième thème qu'on va entendre un peu plus aujourd'hui, c'est trouver des business models qui soient effectifs et à la fois d'un point de vue programmatique et coût, et quels sont les goulots d'étranglement au niveau programmatique et au niveau modélisation business. Le troisième thème, c'est l'identification d'indicateurs clés pour contrôler l'impact à la fois des programmes de fortification après Harvest et avant, ce qu'on va appeler les projets de biofortification. Et enfin, un 4e thème de recherche qui était la contextualisation du rôle et de l'impact de la fortification alimentaire au niveau régional. Next slide. Donc, ce slide-là, c'est vraiment pour vous montrer le processus d'identification. Donc, TOFAS a contractualisé avec AgriNatura en 2018 et AgriNatura a délégué après et contractualisé avec 3 différentes équipes pour répondre aux questions de recherche que je vous ai présentées. Voilà. Je vais arrêter là. Next slide, Ben, c'est juste pour présenter un peu un mapping des différents partenaires qui sont à la fois sur le call d'aujourd'hui et sur qui était présent la semaine dernière avec l'IRD et qui le prochain que l'on aura donc avec Wageningen Université, ce sera le 28 avril prochain. Voilà, donc très bon meeting à vous tous et merci par avance Ben pour tout le travail qui a été effectué et puis pour la présentation d'aujourd'hui. Merci.
Unmuted. Somebody muted
yeah.
me, which is fair enough, really. I'll mute myself. Okay. Thank you, Christophe. So to get to the meat of the workshop, first of all, the aims, scope of work and methodological overview. So the aim of Lot 1 was to identify sustainable and effective business models, particularly for small scale producers for food fortification. And also to try to identify primary drivers and bottlenecks for public and private sector commitment to food fortification. And the areas we were asked to look at were cereal and flour fortification, fortified complementary foods, and nutrient-enriched crops. We try not to use the word biofortification in our work and in this presentation. So if it slips in at some point, my apologies, but this is what we mean by nutrient-enriched crops. So this is a slide that summarizes our overall approach and conceptual framework for undertaking, for trying to answer, to meet these aims and answer these questions. And broadly speaking, we did the work in two phases. The first phase, we did a secondary data systematic review. We went to the literature. We did a quite substantial survey questionnaire with key informants very broadly across this sector. We attempted to develop a typology. Wasn't in our original plan, but we added it as we went along because we felt it was important to do. And I'll let you judge later whether we've been successful. I'm not sure we have, but we've tried. Then in the second formative phase, we've conducted a series of quite in-depth case studies. And the data that the methods from and the questions we've asked in the case studies come from the first phase and are drawn into the second phase. And finally, we try to bring this all together in a synthetic way, systematically in a report, and trying to see if we can understand the data and the relationships between the data. So our methods have been a literature review, a survey, in-depth telephone interviews with a few key informants, a series of case studies, a synthesis, and a final narrative report, which will be available shortly. So how good is the data that we have? How strong is the evidence that we're presenting today? We try to summarize it in this slide. The literature review looked at really quite a large number of texts and a large number of countries. But we found, as you'll see, that actually some of these issues are not well covered in the literature. So that kind of narrows things down a bit. The Key Informant Survey was an online survey with more than 700 people identified and 103 respondents, which is not bad for a very large survey. 39 countries and a range of different stakeholders. Key Informant interviews, we did 9 in-depth interviews, which, as we see, covered a lot of different cases. In the formative stage, we did 12 case studies in 8 countries. And then we also added to this, these are items that were not in our original terms of reference, the typology hypothesis, and we'll talk a little bit later about some political economy work that we've done, which we think is quite interesting and maybe something for the future. So we had some challenges. I've never been in a research project that didn't have challenges, but we started this before the pandemic. Originally, our case studies were going to be based on field research, and some of the case studies were, but then we had a COVID pandemic and a safety issue, and we had to change our method. So you know, I think it's only fair to share that the methodology changed as we went through. And we had to replace some of these remote interviews with interviews ably managed by local counterparts who knew the landscape very well. From a personal point of view, I think this experience worked well. The only thing that I find that is missing with this approach is the potential for serendipity and the possibility for knocking on someone's door and trying to, as we might say in English, doorstep people to force them to talk to you. So that didn't happen as much as we might have hoped. So, you know, I would always prefer to do case studies in person if it was possible. Right, so I'm going to hand over now to Baqir, who's going to talk about the literature review. Please do, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. Baqir?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Next slide, then, please. Okay. Well, we were tasked with examining the efficacy of different business models used in the delivery of fortified foods and to kind of draw lessons for low and middle income countries. So we did this by adapting an approach used by Cooper et al., which included a review of published studies. So that included peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, etc., through kind of a systematic keyword search in relevant databases. And then we initially screened the articles for suitability, and then through a program growing method, which is like a snowballing method, we identified other literature, including key grey literature. And then in the final step, we screened again for based on relevance and importance. And we also looked at the main catalogues in the British Library. So there were some interesting trade journals there, and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine.
Baqir? Yes,
sorry. Yeah.
I don't know whether you can switch to another microphone, but we're getting a sort of strange buzzing noise on your microphone.
Okay. Is that better?
No, it's exactly the same.
Okay.
Then talk slowly.
Yeah, will do. Okay, next slide, please. So we wanted to kind of identify what are the main business models used, and we felt that there were four main business models coming through. The first being public sector-led models. So these are largely successful in a number of countries, coupled with mandatory fortification, where regulation has been enforceable, and there's a mixture of incentives provided by the public sector. So you know, a heavy influence from the public sector by way of subsidy, and in terms of low and middle income countries, that often I think associated with social safety nets. The second model, private sector-led models, these were kind of followed by with voluntary vertification. So and usually larger scale centralized production where successful with varying degrees of input from the public sector. The third model, multi-sector partnerships. So in the fortification sphere, these were kind of with like national fortification alliances, where there's cross-sector collaboration, public sector bodies, private sector, and civil society. And in terms of nutrient-enriched crops, Harvest Plus mostly used multi-sector partnerships. And the fourth, not many of these found in the literature, but these kind of community-led models usually supported by NGOs. Next slide. When we tried to kind of evaluate these business models in terms of overall business viability, we felt it was a bit thin, especially in terms of issues to do with business plans, targets, and the overall business case. So very limited. But the vast majority of articles, it was kind of heavily skewed towards large-scale staple fortification, coupled with mandatory fortification, and a focus on wheat, maize, and oil. Where failure was documented, particularly for these kind of types of fortification programs, failure was linked to poor compliance, so the difficulty kind of enforcing compliance, where legislation was scarce, the choice of food vehicle was poor often, and or issues to do with equipment or premix. We felt that I think the literature certainly identifies kind of industrial fortification and success stories at scale, but doesn't deal very well with kind of informal markets, small scale, and reaching the poorest. And overall, there tends to be a bias in the literature towards obviously success stories, very few kind of documented projects which have failed or which at least have been kind of presented that way. And a little bit in terms of nutrient-enriched crops, kind of also a bias towards kind of overall scale. So issues to do with kind of number of varieties released, seed produced, but limited kind of examples of push and pull models. Though there were examples of kind of extension modalities, etc. And very little evidence we found of business models related to complementary foods. Thanks, Ben. Next slide.
Yeah, our apologies for the sound. We're going to take Baqir's laptop out and smash it in the street when we finish this workshop. Hopefully mine is a bit better. So I should add to that this literature, another drawback perhaps of the literature survey is that it was focused on work in the English language, and I think we just need to be open about that, and I'm sure there is work that we did not find published in other languages. So from the literature review, the team drew together a framework to try to build a set of research questions, and this was the framework that we used. So what we were trying to get at with this was trying to understand the background fundamental business viability strategy of different business models, hence the different colors, starting with a central business case for an individual business and working out to a societal business case. And then these arrows reflect different trade-offs that we found in the literature, that recurred in the literature. So the degree of maturity of the business, whether it was a new one or whether it had been around for a long time, the different type of process that a project followed, so output versus process approaches, various different scales from very small or on-farm consumption up to large factories. The voluntary versus mandatory debate, the tradable versus non-tradable. I'm a trade economist, so for those of you that aren't, this is about things that cross borders and how those affect what we're trying to do. And then finally, the relationship between public and private sector, which is not already 100% functional. So this was the framework that we used to draw up our questions. So we move on to the key informant survey and the results of the key informant survey. The method here, actually I said 700 in one of the earlier slides. It says 790 here, but the number of responses is still the same. Quite a wide range of respondents. You find with this type of survey work that those of us that work in research or work in the donor field, we're quite good at filling out surveys. A little harder to get people from the private sector and particularly people from the government sector to fill out forms. So we did okay. We based our topics on the conceptual framework. We looked at project types, standards, funding, the target market, technologies and premixes, sustainability and compliance. And we applied a range of different analysis to the data that we got to try to see if we could find any relationships. So bivariate association, statistical inference, and thematic analysis. So what were the limitations of this approach? There's a certain amount of selection bias. As a result of the survey, design may have only those respondents which agree with fortification are likely to be more positive. Finding a universe list of people who we could send a questionnaire to was already quite a difficult thing to do and had a certain amount of bias associated with it. These are people that attended meetings or are known in this field. Slightly weaker influence of government and private sector, as I said before. Third sector respondents should also be acknowledged. The sample size is small and the universe unknown. Whilst we attempted to explore statistical inference, we don't claim to provide a fully evidence solution. It's just inference. Very difficult to collate a list of candidates to do interviews and meet data protection requirements. So we solved this by asking each individual to commit to the survey. And by having this kind of two-level of questioning, we solved our GDPR issues, but we reduced the number of people that were willing to collaborate. We should say that this subject is very broad, a wide range of different fortification, biofortification, nutrient-enriched crops, and industrial fortification in the same questionnaire. A lot of people found very difficult. The survey instrument was long, too long. The survey instrument's almost always too long, such is life. So just a few things that come out of this survey and some drivers. So the factors that promote business success, perceived project success was strongly correlates with sustainability. So people think it's a success. They also think it's sustainable. Seems obvious, but there we are. Non-target initiatives seem to be more successful than those that focus on a population cohort. Larger firm models more successful than self-sustaining, and these findings were consistent across all regions. So again, a few highlights here. Firms depend on premixes, and this is the focus of trade issue. Testing, there's a strong correlation between in-factory testing and sustainability, we found. Any standards are better than no standards, so significant relationship between voluntary and mandatory standards and business sustainability. No particular model stands out as successful, which is perhaps a bit disappointing. Different delivery models, home fortification, SME, large firm, not positively correlated with success or sustainability, except for seed companies and nutrient-enriched crops. And finally, the stats show us that a business plan matters. Initiatives with a business plan were in the top half of our self-sustaining index, which is the thing in the top right-hand corner. I put on this slide a few examples of things people said during this, just to kind of highlight a few of the comments that we got in this survey. For fortification, industrial fortification, we found that success strongly related to government support and private sector involvement. Sub-themes of government were legislation enforcement, governance subsidy. For example, legislation consisted of enabling standards, regulation, mandating involvement of the private sector players, whilst enforcement involved, so monitoring and lab testing. One respondent said that mandatory law and regulations and strong enforcement and compliance, in answer to the question, what is required for fortification projects to be successful? So people are rather polarized on this issue, we found. Government subsidies in the form of training and/or equipment were also mentioned as reason behind successful projects. Private sector involvement through buy-in and attendance at training, sources of equipment were additional reasons provided for success. Availability of funding to provide financial and technical assistance to the food manufacturers to ensure they are competitive and produced to meet the standards. So this issue of competition was a very common response. For nutrient-enriched crops, extension models are absolutely key. One respondent said, availability of seed companies adopting the increase of biofortified bean seed, farmers willing to engage in utilizing biofortified beans. Another respondent said, no increasing costs for farmers, clear value of smallholders and their families, taste good and access to market. So this issue of the additional cost and its effect on business viability was a recurring theme. So some conclusions from the Key Informant survey. Business model is perceived as critical to success and sustainability of projects. Quality compliance, mandatory fortification level of approved standards, and firm size impact the perceived levels of success of initiatives. So this suggests that successful implementation and sustainability of initiatives invariably consists of mandatory fortification, not always, but often, involvement of a range of bodies, including public and private sector, equipment and training support, high quality assurance, and engagement of medium and larger firms. So these criteria are likely to be elements required to deliver successful fortification initiatives in LMICs. It seems from this survey. So as we went along with this process, we were trying to synthesize the work. So this is our synthesis of the literature review and the survey from the first phase. So this seems to suggest it's easier to work with a small number of larger businesses than a large number of smaller ones in order to achieve wider societal benefits. Supporters of food fortification should not be afraid to start at scale. Where scale is achieved by large numbers of small businesses, then coordination and partnership is absolutely crucial for success. All texts point to the greater success of projects where fortification is mandatory and properly monitored and regulated. Projects depend on a high level of tradables, so imported ingredients, imported technology are more prone to failure, and therefore domestic ingredients and technologies would always be preferred to avoid this bottleneck. A balance of public-private sector engagement is important, but not always essential. So if there is already strong horizontal coordination in the private sector, then it can work without government engagement. And there's some really good examples of that around the world. Mature businesses are more likely to implement a business model because they have experience. And they've also invested quite a lot already, so much of their capital investment is sunk. Intervention length, developing viable business model takes time. I'm sure everybody knows this, but it takes time and it's complicated. And a certain amount of failure is normal in starting businesses. Most texts recommend that, as well as measuring absolute outputs, intervention should set targets for key elements of the business development process. And these are often not KPIs, we found. Right, so to move on to the next stage of phase one, the key informant interviews, and I think maybe one or two people on the call who were kind enough to help out with these very deep and very interesting interviews that we did. So these are interviews with people who have been involved in lots of different cases, and they were asked to select a range of different cases in many different countries. So you can see with the coding here, you find one interviewer would do 3 or 4 different cases, and we work through each case with the same set of questions across, with a single interviewer across a range of different geographies. And we tried to get of the in-depth interviews, a reasonable range of stakeholders. What are the limitations with doing it this way? The sample was small, but I would say that the analysis is deep. We had to conduct this over a very long period of time because of COVID. The project extended for a long time, and that wasn't ideal. I think it would have been better in retrospect to try to do it in a shorter period of time, because the landscape in the background was changing. So what did we find from these key expert interviews? And does this match up with the stuff from the literature review and the survey that we did? So the key experts on scale, most experts agreed that starting at artisanal or SME level wasn't always successful. It's hard to start a food business if it doesn't already exist. So complementary foods fall into this area where you're trying to start a business from the very beginning. Mandatory versus voluntary fortification. Most experts favor mandatory fortification for industrial fortification of staples. In terms of the relationship between government and donor and private sector, it seems to depend on the relationship between the private sector and other actors. Everybody came back to this from the various, whether they came from a research angle or a private sector angle or a donor angle. Technology choice. Many experts were concerned that donors are attracted by silver bullets and that access to key technology can crowd out competition. So this is partly the problem of technology being attractive and subsidy being available. Marketing support. All experts considered failure to address consumer attitudes a common cause of failure for all types of fortification. But price and availability more important than quality was a common theme. It's often missing from design, it seems. Maybe not with nutrient-enriched crops, but certainly with some fortification programs. Compliance. Very few experts supported voluntary standards for fortified foods, but all wanted more effort to prevent freeloading, undermining fortification efforts. So in a way, these things contradict each other. On trade, issues of import and tax policy were pervasive. On viability, experts had few examples of fully sustainable food fortification business models that were fully self-sustaining and viable. And we might circle back to debate that later. Cost of doing business is an issue that is often missing from the design of some of these programs and interventions. So a really good example of this is the cost of getting energy to a business and then of keeping it at that business. It is causing all sorts of problems, and it's just not considered at an early stage. And as we've said before, the key experts also agreed that business plans were usually missing. Right. So having gathered all of this data from these different sources, we then tried to pull out a typology to see whether we could cluster some of the examples of business models and fortification types in a way that might be useful for future analysis. And in this typology, we took 5 steps. So the first step was the literature search. The second step was identifying and coding cases according to type of fortificant and fortification method against the 17 different business dimensions that we'd identified earlier in our framework. We then built a database with cases, countries, and food vehicles. And we applied some statistical analysis to it, scoring cases on a scale of from successful to unsuccessful, and testing versus different dimensions. So this then resulted into a proposed initial typology using cluster analysis. This was quite hard to do. and we should ask ourselves whether it was worthwhile doing it. It wasn't particularly satisfying clustering the analysis from the literature, and we found the results, we're trying to be as honest as we can here. We found the results quite hard to explain. Clusters and types reapplied or tested with case studies. So we came back to our case studies, which I'll talk about in a minute, and we retested these against the case studies to try to strengthen the types that we came up with. This gives you the results of some of this, the cluster analysis on the left-hand side, which started to identify 4 broad groups. And then we applied this non-metric multi-dimensional scaling approach to try to bring these things together and show whether they had relationships with each other in different types. And then from this quite attractive graph on the right-hand side, we came up with these final sets of clusters in 4 different groups. These are what we're calling emergent groups, and it's really a starting point. It's not a definitional finishing point. So mandatory regulation without quality infrastructure leads to disappointing results. So Group A is an example here of high quality standards identified with a good commercial environment, but absence of regulation. Coherent value chains find it easier to self-regulate in higher income economies and are not as impacted by scale or as complex as dispersed value chains. So the type B is low quality standards is identified with some supportive regulations, but predominantly unregulated. Public-private partnerships successful in less structured low-income economies where value chains are highly dispersed, but the vehicles were processed in a more centralized way, such as vegetable oil and sugar. So example of this is in Group C. So we've got a high quality standard identified with good supportive regulations and commercial environment. And then the final cluster in this typology, scale is not a success factor, where other policies undermine fortification initiatives, particularly domestic regulation, market intervention by government, absence of quality infrastructure. So the Group D is low supportive regulations with a high rate of unsuccessful programs. So you can see that in this matrices here, we've got top left and bottom right, low success, and top right and bottom left, high success, and different examples of continuous intervention and direct intervention. So it is where it is. It's a starting point for a typology and a cluster analysis, and it's something to debate, I feel. So what do we find from this? So in terms of bottlenecks, viable supply of suitable ingredients, including where appropriate import of equipment and ingredients, access to capital and technology to start and grow sustainable businesses, suitable incentives to mitigate risk, particularly of early adopters, and unconstrained and viable demand for fortified product, a condition of success. In terms of drivers, scale of operation, business maturity, public and private sector engagement, mandatory inclusion, and tradability. Okay, so moving on to phase 2 of the research. In the formative phase, we drilled down to a number of individual case studies. The method here was to try to select case studies across a broad geography. And we did Africa, West and East, and South Asia. We also tried to cover both English and French-speaking areas. We tried to identify case studies at different levels of maturity, projects and programs that had started and in some cases had finished. We looked at different fortification methods, and we tried to look at different approaches. So limitations with the case studies. We would have liked to have included Southeast Asian examples. This was in the original plan, but COVID meant that we ended up not doing that. It's a pity because there's some good examples in this area. We found that for some actors and countries, it was very hard to get people to talk to us remotely. And this was particularly the case for the private sector and to some extent government in Chad, Niger and Madagascar. So these are the case studies we looked at. There's 12 case studies. And these are the countries and the range of different fortification approaches. Quite a lot in Rwanda. We did the Rwanda ones in person. We did the Kenya and Tanzania one in person. For Bangladesh, Madagascar, Niger, and Chad, these were done remotely. So we tried to build these case studies with a standard content so that each case study could stand alone. So in each case study, you'll find key findings, country background, the country nutritional status, the basic demographics, and the background, the story, narrative of the case study. And then the results of interviews by theme identified earlier in this process. Then a discussion of the business case and the business approach, and some information about the impact. Then a discussion of viability and sustainability of this particular business model and some conclusions and lessons. So we had some sort of consistent things going through here. There was we built a timeline. We tried to build a stakeholder business model map to show the relationship and what had been subsidized or partially subsidized, to try to understand some issues of viability in these stories and also where the project occurred. So we're going to give you 3 examples today because we don't have time to do all 12, sadly, but this will be published later, so you'll be able to work through the other examples. And the first one I'm going to do, and then I'll get my colleagues to do the other 2. The first one is the Bangladesh fortified rice kernels, PUSHTI CHAL, or nutritious rice, which comes out of the ultra rice work that had been going on for a number of years. So for Bangladesh, rice is a critical staple food, 70% of all calories. It's got severe micronutrient deficiencies. What's interesting about Bangladesh is that the domestic rice market is highly distorted, and it's one of the reasons why we wanted to choose this case. So government rice procurement and distribution system, social safety nets and donor support mean that this is a very complicated set of interactions within this space. So the process consists of milled rice fortified using reconstituted hot extruded kernels. So the extruder is critical to making this work. And the rough cost of doing this is about 4 to 5 taka a kilogram. And if Nurul could put in the chat how much that is in US dollars, I'd appreciate it, because I should have done it and I haven't. The intervention started a long time ago in 2013. And it's interesting that, you know, a team went off to China and was so motivated by what they saw. They started on this long and complicated journey. I think somebody's got their mic turned on. We could ask them to mute. Thank you very much. So where they are now is talk about massive expansion of this to cover millions of individuals. So it's really grown from very small to really something quite impressive. But there is a complicated jigsaw of donor programs and different feeding activities going on in Bangladesh, which we have attempted to explain with this rather complicated diagram. And the kind of key moving parts here are the national rice price procurement and distribution system, which sets prices and buys rice, intervenes to buy rice. Okay, we have some French coming into the thing now. All right, that's gone, that's good. The National Safety Net Program and the Rice Fortification Program, which all have to intervene in this space with all of these different ministries and actors to bring fortified rice into the market and out to the consumers. This is the map of the business model and the different stakeholder linkages. So you can see that certain aspects of this are fully private, but large chunks of it are subsidized in different ways, which is a political decision or a donor decision, and that is fine. But what this does is kind of give you a starting point for a conversation about what viability might really mean. What are the key findings from this case study? The model for rice fortification is through addition of extruded fortified rice kernel supplied by private sector contractors under contract to donors to rice provided as a subsidy to vulnerable groups by various government and donor funded food security schemes. Rice fortification through extruded kernels is technically possible and accepted by the consumer, but is financially unsustainable without either government or donor support. So attempts have been made to try to create a consumer niche to see if companies can sell the product at a premium price to high-end consumers, these attempts have been a very good thing to do, but they haven't worked very well. They haven't created a kind of market for cross-subsidy. Local equipment manufacture greatly increased the industry uptake of this stage in the process, and as kind of one of the key drivers of success was sorting out this local equipment problem. Compliance and regulation at scale remains a challenge for rice fortification outside the narrow confines of the national feeding program. So that's a challenge for the future and a challenge for scale. Fortification at scale alongside national food price stabilization and safety net feeding programs is desirable, but it's not sustainable or economically efficient in the long run. So this is a political decision at the end of the day, and this is where aspects of political economy start to invade this space. What are the lessons? All actors refer to the importance of public awareness and education about food fortification in Bangladesh, and nobody seems to take leadership or responsibility for it. The important role of rice in the political economy of Bangladesh cannot be divorced from food fortification policy. It's also a very interesting issue for the future. Fortification by addition of kernels is acceptable to the consumer and effective, but adds more costs than consumers can pay, making mandatory fortification likely to be subverted and voluntary fortification unlikely to be widespread. So these are policy choices made jointly by government and donors, rather than by private sector or national actors. And finally, premix, the taxation and excessive bureaucracy for this program continue to be a pervasive problem, which seems a simple thing to resolve, but it turns out it isn't. So I'm going to hand over to Baqir now to talk about Tanzania.
Thanks, Ben. Well, yeah, we felt so this is a fortified maize flour case study in Tanzania, and actually we felt this was one of the more exciting case studies, especially because it addresses kind of small scale, medium scale fortification. And just by way of background, maize flour fortification was made mandatory in 2011. This, however, extends only to large scale processors and small and medium scale millers that are exempt to our knowledge. But there are very few large-scale processors of maize flour in Tanzania, and they control only a small market share compared to small and medium-scale millers. So the issue at hand then is kind of how do you incentivize small and medium-scale millers, where there isn't legislation as well, and ensure compliance. So for those of you not familiar, Sanku was founded by Felix Brooks Church and David Dodson, and first established operations in Tanzania. They're now working with more than 600 mills to date, well, millers, they've kind of come up with a patented dosifier for small scale or medium scale fortification. And they've coupled this with a quite an innovative revenue generating model. So through the sale of empty branded bags, they sell it as a bundle. So the empty branded bags sold to millers, and the premix is sold is provided at no additional cost. And you can see on the left hand side that if you look at kind of the small scale millers, a large proportion of their costs would usually kind of include premix and the cost of bags and maintenance. Sanko have kind of really incentivized millers, with the provision of premix at no additional cost. They're also since 2018 have an automated system. So it's IoT enabled, and this is done through some kind of cloud thing with Vodafone. So they're able to kind of monitor and evaluate the amount of premix remotely, and the production, etc. So this kind of greatly reduces human error, both in terms of kind of their maintenance, but also in terms of ensuring compliance. We did find that, but there is kind of obviously a trade-off given the expense of these dosifiers, which are quite expensive compared to what's on the market. A typical Sanko dosifier costs between $2,000 to $2,500 compared to a Chinese microfeeder, which is a lot cheaper, but perhaps not as reliable. Next slide, please. So you can see here, that there are two models. So I think in the chat, someone brought up small scale fortification. Here you can see the dosifier is used on a small scale hammer mill, and to our knowledge, it's the only one in East Africa at the moment on the market. And they're able to also use the dosifier on medium level scale milling as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the overall model, we felt this was a kind of a multi-sector partnership business model. Sanko is partly subsidized because they do get grants from international organizations, donors, etc. But through their revenue model, they're partially commercialized too. They've teamed up with Vodafone as well, so there's the element of the private sector influence too. Some obviously the government support too, and international organizations. Some of the key issues that were brought up by the stakeholders that we interviewed. One was that in terms of Sanko not being considered a business, so they're kind of, it's a halfway house, and that's a significant cost to them in terms of the premix that they import. So they brought up that's a big issue, and if this was to be waived, it would significantly improve their bottom line.
Baqir?
Yeah, sorry.
They're really struggling to understand you, so maybe I can just read out the bits from this slide.
Yeah, sure, okay.
Because you've nearly finished. Sorry to interrupt you, but the buzzing noise on your thing is...
Okay, yeah, go ahead, I'll just... Yeah.
Is terrible. On this last slide, you can see that Sanko also struggled with legislation issues. We've seen that come up in previous discussions. Conformity issues, wheat flour fortification, successful because 90% of wheat consumed is imported and processed by large-scale millers. Maize oil fortification not mandatory for small medium scale to comply with fortification legislation at present. Support mechanism to assist the small scale millers to get dosifiers and comply with relevant guidelines. Obstacles currently facing the fortification of maize flour in Tanzania the limited number of companies, organizations supplying premixes. Though quality is checked at the manufacturer level, premix quality is not checked regularly once it arrives. And then there's this trade-in issue. The cost of getting premix across borders is punitive. So what's really interesting about this case study is that Sanku have found a technical solution, or possible technical solution, to the issue of very small scale and home consumption for fortification, which is, you know, to some senses a much desired outcome. And so, in a way, contrary to what we said earlier, you know, donors like silver bullets, but sometimes a silver bullet is a really good thing. And I don't know whether Baqir would agree, but I think Sanku is a really nice example of a good, a high quality technical, relatively simple technical intervention. The lessons learned from this through maize flour fortification. Though maize flour fortification is mandatory in Tanzania, small and medium scale millers are exempt. So phasing in mandatory fortification for small millers would likely improve compliance, maybe. Equally, the government needs support in enforcement of regulation and to monitor compliance. It's the same picture in many countries, that the monitoring of compliance is infrastructure that people can't afford. Sanko experimenting with different models with posho mills. These are service millers where people bring grain, mill it, and get it back. And as I said before, you know, these are people that are falling below the radar of fortification. So they're keen to have a subsidy to make that work. Such as VAT waiving. I know from experience persuading the Treasury to waive VAT is very hard. Takes many years to do. Sanko are providing free maintenance support to the millers they engage with. It's not clear, though, how they will be able to provide support as they expand. So this issue of maintenance and of equipment and the training of local technicians, blacksmiths, whatever it is often missing from technologically driven solutions. Low public awareness among millers and the population at large currently exists, given a large number of mills. At least owners, engaging owners should be encouraged, so that the model for posho mills, for service mills, is often that these are absentee owners and they're not owner operators. So it's that makes them harder to reach because they're hard to find. Baqir, I hope that was okay.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Okay, so Aurelie.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to present to you the last case study. This is fortified complementary flour from Madagascar. So I don't know if you know, but Madagascar has a particularly high level of infant malnutrition. In 2020, it was considered that half of the children are stunted in Madagascar. The legislation for food fortification is quite weak currently. There is only one product that has mandatory fortification in Madagascar. This is iodized salt. And for the fortified composite flour, there are no currently standards. There are plans of developing those voluntarily in the first place, but they haven't been firmed up. So the story of the fortified flour in Madagascar and NUTRITIOUS is the following. So in 2002, there was an initiative from GRET, which is a development agency, NGO linked to the French Development Agency, and IRD, Institute of Research for Development, to develop a fortified flour. So they worked together with a private company called TAF, and they developed this flour called Kobina, which means flower of life in the Malagasy language. And this was successful. And as a result, in 2013, the NutriTious company was developed, and this is a distribution company. In 2017, the company went further with the development of another product than the flour. This was a cereal bar, and this time they worked with another processor, the Chocolaterie Robert. Next slide, please. So the NutriTious company operates via a distribution channel system. The originality of the system, it has 3 different channels. So on one hand, you have the social distribution channel, which represents about a quarter of the market. And so this is a distribution channel that really aims at reaching the poor. And the way they do that, they have created what they call restaurants for babies, where people from the community, from the poor communities, can go and have porridge served to them. So it's made by local community workers that called animatrices, who are employed by NutriTious, and they make the product for the poor country, for the poor communities. Together with the feeding, there is also a number of activities such as nutrition education, social services, and so on. So this is part of the distribution. Another part is the standard distribution, which is about 50% of the products that are sold through a standard system, such as supermarkets, grocery stores, markets, and so on. And finally, there is the NGO distribution, which represents about a quarter of the product, whereby NutriTious sells to NGOs, then they redistribute the products to populations. So these are very vulnerable populations for free. So since its launch in 2013, NutriTious has distributed nearly 59 million servings of flour, around 33 municipalities, and more than 100 neighborhoods and rural groups. The company is now working on making an improved version of its product. So this shows that the company is really reaching out to the community, reaching out to poor, and has quite an impact. So the way they do it, they sell the product at a low price. The cost of one portion is about 0.6 euros. And the margin, the product's margin is at its lowest. Next slide, please. So if we looked at the system, so we've looked at, if on the left-hand side, this diagram shows the NutriTious model as described by the company. So the CEO described it as a multi-sector partnership business model, private sector driven. So you could see NutriTious at the center, the 2 processing factories for the cereal bar, La Chocolaterie Robert and the TAF on the left. And those 2 are supported by large groups in Madagascar, so by actually powerful groups that don't only do work on food industry, but they have a range of products supporting those processing groups, and then NutriTious. Sorry, next slide. And sorry, Ben, could you please go back to the previous slide? Yes, so on one hand, you've got NutriTious supported by this group through its processes. Then you've got GREX, which is the research and development aspect that's also in this diagram. And then the 3 the distribution channels. So the Anima, for instance, is a charity, and there's a foundation, and you could see that it's selling, and it's selling to supermarkets, but also directly to communities via its social program. So so this is a system. We've noticed that talking to the different stakeholders, there are a number of issues with such an approach. So there was reported there were trade issues. So the fortificant is imported from South Africa. There are often problems with delay. There is also, this also causes a limited shelf life on the minerals and vitamins. So this is a problem for the company. When on the analysis of the products have to be made, there's no facilities in Madagascar to do such analysis, so they have to be sent abroad. In terms of legislations, as I was saying, there's a little support from the Malagasy government, and there's not a lot of the Bureau of Standards doesn't have standards for the fortification and fortified flour. And NutriTious would like to see more government support, in particular the taxation of fortificant. There's also an unfair product competition. Multinationals such as NutriTious distributing products for free to the population caused the deregulation of the market. And also there are scaling issues. So the product is very popular. There is an increasing demand, but the local suppliers do not always follow on the quantity that are needed. And finally, the margin of the product is very small. The product is sold at a very low price. That is good for the consumer, but on the company side, this causes an imbalance, and the company is depending upon other institutions to help it to sustain it. The next slide, please. So the lessons. So we've seen that NutriTious is a socially driven model. It leads to high nutritional impact. Next. The company has very low margins. That means he has not sufficient funds to invest into new equipment, develop new products, to conduct research and development. It's depending upon external aid, such as the grant for its sustainability. The government support is almost none, which means that the business environment is difficult. There's unfair competition. The taxation makes it difficult for the company. So finally, we could say that the NutriTious model in Madagascar is successful, but I wish, as we have shown, it is also very fragile. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurelie. So what we did next is we tried to synthesize the outcome of these case studies, because we had a consistent approach to all of them. So we then tested them against our different themes that we identified earlier in this process, and undertook some coding and analysis. I'm sorry, the text is very small here, but the colors are just to give you an idea of this was the sort of coding approach that we were doing. So some highlights of the findings from the synthesis. We found that for the fortification of staples, concerted efforts are needed to persuade governments to address this taxation and duty problem for food fortification sector, where local suppliers are not available and where these are unlikely to emerge in the near future. One solution would be more regional approaches. Inadequate underlying standards, infrastructure and compliance mechanisms is a pervasive brake on development of many aspects of food fortification. Business viability is important, and mature, large-scale, established businesses are more likely to succeed. For complementary foods, if key equipment or ingredients or packaging is not available in the target country, plans need to be made to ensure that it can be imported and that the technical support is available to make it work. Creating a domestic equipment production and maintenance capacity should be an accepted aim of encouraging businesses to take up fortified complementary foods. And it's often missing. Complementary food interventions are harder to manage and regulate for governments because there's lots of different bits to them, the many different ingredients, food safety issues, harder to identify and control when you have limited infrastructure. Lots of different ministries often involved. Maturer businesses, larger scale, less prone to failure, more robust, need to be considered rather than startups, particularly for complementary foods. It's interesting how common that projects try to start new businesses for complementary foods, and they seldom survive. The limited case studies presented here suggest that this type of intervention struggles with viability. For nutrition-enriched foods, viability at scale for nutrition-enriched foods depends on C certification and quality assurance infrastructure. The transition from fortification project to self-sustaining fortification needs to be considered at pre-design and formative stages of fortification investments. This issue is particularly highlighted by the challenge of introducing technologies into complex systems such as small-scale farming. For push-pull models of production, so this is when you try to create a demand for a product at the same time you create the supply in an iterative approach. Market development still struggles to achieve sustainability and viability. Creating the demand doesn't always produce the supply. So we have a whole other section on political economy, which was done by our colleague who's a political economist, Aurelie. And I'm not going to go into huge detail, but these things are quite contentious and interesting. So I'm just going to highlight a few things. The approach that she adopted was what's called multi-scalar political economy. So this looks at the macro level, the sectoral level, and the micro level, and tries to see the tensions and relationships between these three different levels. And from this work and from reviewing our case studies, she came up with some interesting new questions, which I'd just like to share because I think they're just contentious and interesting. So she asked, are concerns about viability and efficiency the correct issue to be worrying about in the context of tackling malnutrition? We're some of us, Baqir and I, are economists. We're interested in viability. Is it always the right question? Is it correct to frame the battle to cure people from obesity and NCDs as a market where output-oriented firms can direct their investments and make profit? Is public-private partnership model really a win-win? These are questions. I don't have answers to these questions. These are things that she would like to interrogate that come out of our work. With our food system playing a major role in being the problem as well as the solution for environmental collapse and global health crisis, is the focus on food fortification by international organizations, governments and private sector the most effective solution to drive the urgently needed transformation? Who is allowed to speak with authority about nutrition and whose voice is silenced? What are the implications of food fortification programs on local markets, food environments, and rural livelihoods? So these are all quite new and interesting fields of research, and maybe speak a bit to Mohammed's question about what might we do more of, and what might we do next. So just to try to draw together, because we don't have so much time left, high-level take-homes and future actions and themes. We feel that if viability is the aim, then plans for viability need to happen pre-intervention, not during intervention. Assessment and scaling of innovations needs to be focused on this issue of viability, and it often fails to do that. We're suggesting a standardized package to address policy issues because the same policy issues continue to reoccur. And then finally, these contentious political economy questions: are benefits equally shared from these interventions? Are the gains from the intervention in one socioeconomic sector worth the costs in others? We have some publications which I would encourage you to go and read. first covering the literature review, and then with a lot more detail about the survey instrument, and finally trying to explain the typology. We still have another 2 or 3 publications to do in this project once we've finished the final reports. I think we're hoping to complete the case studies and the synthesis of the case studies in mid-May, and to deliver a final project synthetic report will be available to everybody from the end of May. I want to acknowledge a large number of people involved in this activity from within NRI and a number of consultants and collaborators, without whom we couldn't, particularly the case studies, could not have been done without the colleagues at the bottom of this list who made the work interesting and enjoyable and opened doors for us. So we're very grateful to them. So I have finished with the slides, so I'm going to stop sharing and ask my colleagues to quickly come onto the line and see if we can address 1 or 2 questions on the chat. Aurelie, Baqir, can you turn on your camera?
Hi, Ben. Yeah, we've answered most of them, but there are a few. Yeah.
Mohammed, you had a very thoughtful question, actually. If you were lucky enough to provide the opportunity of funding, say, of the same size as the first one, what aspects of research would you focus on? Would you use the same method and bring more methodological tools? It's a really good question. So you probably won't like the first answer to this bit, but you probably know what I'm going to say. I think trying to blend together research on 3 different types of fortification made it very difficult for us to conduct statistical analysis from the work that we did. So the answers that people gave on nutrient-enriched crops were hard to compare with the answers from large-scale fortification, industrial fortification, and complementary foods. So these are really 3 different things. And trying to draw inference across, I wouldn't do it that way another time. I think it would have been exciting to have had a political economist involved from the beginning, because I think these issues of where food and food systems, nutrition and environment, bump into complicated domestic political government systems are very interesting, and I think it's a new field to try to understand and navigate for people who are trying to do this sort of intervention to prevent failure as a result of not understanding the political economy landscape, or building in things to address the political economy landscape. Are there any other questions, guys, that we should try to address, or questions that individuals might have that they didn't want to put in the chat? Please put your hand up if you want to speak. Links to the publications in the chat box. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. If somebody if you email me, or if somebody puts from NRI puts their email address in the chat, then Akasua can email us for the copies. Mohammed.
Yes, do you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think I put this question in the chat. I'm obsessed by this typology of business models, and it is a very attractive approach, but at the same time, it's not inclusive. I think there are some business models that are not within these 4 definitions of business models, and especially the multi-sector based business model. It has lots of varieties, and who dominates in the multi-sector partnership, etc. So this is a question. Would you think that it would be useful to pursue this research in the future if you are lucky to be given another funding? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, you've been with us on this journey with the typology, and I think it was you, Mohammed, that first kind of whispered in our ears, you really need a typology, and you were right. And would we do it this way? I'm not sure. I haven't found the statistical method we applied very satisfying. I'll be honest. So I'm not sure I would do it again this way. Baqir, do you have any views?
Not off the top of my head, but yeah, would welcome more funding. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, thanks for that. But yeah, I think we need typologies, but I think trying to create typologies across these different approaches to fortification also cause problem, Mohammed. So you're right, the things that fall out of these boxes. I think if we'd just done a typology on industrial fortification and done 3 different typologies, it would have worked better.
Ben, just one last thing. I think we have not made justice to the complementary food, the fortified complementary food in general, not just in the case studies, but also going through the in-depth through the business models. Most of these projects are startup projects and small-scale projects, so we cannot say because business-wise they don't work, so we just forget about them. So there are some success, and I think we should focus a little bit on some success. They're mostly social business enterprise, women's based activities, etc. I think we should be a little bit more, let's say, give more attention to this than saying, well, it doesn't work business-wise. So thank you.
No, I think it's fair comment, Mohammed. Yeah, I think it's fair comment. Christophe, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's rather a comment than a question. Talking of the traditional sort of obstacles, I think you alluded to it, but I wanted to clarify with you. My personal experience is that in setting up projects or companies related to food fortification, often the background work, i.e., for example, market studies, making sure that you actually fortify the right products for the right audience and sell to the right market. I found that very much lacking. We, organization, NGOs, we've done that. We've done this in country X, and we're just going to do the same and apply the same model in country Y. But we all know, the settings are different, the populations, the consumption habits. So did it come up in your research as a weakness more than an obstacle of that background work that needs to be done? I think you develop your business model.
No, I think it's so. We kind of use developing a business model as a catch-all for all of those things, but. A lot of the landscape that we were looking at, and this goes back 3 years, this work, I think there's been some recent changes, and we should recognize that. And I'm conscious that GAIN are doing a lot more landscaping and scoping work prior to interventions, and that speaks to what you're talking about, Christophe. That money invested in understanding the landscape is money well invested, and because you're much more likely to succeed if you get some information from this stage.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody else? Or we should draw this to a conclusion because I've already got the translators on overtime. Aurelie, is there anybody else with a hand up? Because I can't see any of the. No, I think we're good. So Mohammed or Christophe, would you like to make some closing remarks?
Just briefly from my side, just a big thank you to you and your team. We know that how much work you've been through. The list of publications speaks that you've been able to publish, speaks for the high quality of the work that's been put through by the team, and despite the past 3 years that we've experienced. So congratulations to you all. I really enjoyed the questions that you just showed at the end, that are potential new research avenues, because they are quite unique, and I wish and I hope that you'll be able to explore them, because the economical side of things is often overlooked in a way, simply because we are in the field of nutrition, but it's one side. I have an economical background, and like you, so it's a side that really, for me, has been a little bit overlooked over the past. And in my earlier comment, I was saying that we're trying to consolidate the evidence base. I think the evidence base around the economics of food fortification needs to be further strengthened. So your research looked into it, and I think was quite innovative in doing this, and I hope we can continue to do that. So thank you to you and your team, and I hope that we can continue this work around economics around food fortification.
No, thank you very much, Christophe. Mohammed, I don't know whether you want a last word.
Well, I fully agree with Christophe, and I just want to personally express my appreciation and my really, I learned a lot from this research team and from the work that you have done. It has been one of the most productive and prolific, actually, research project among the 3 we have. I learned a lot, and you raised so many questions. You talked to us as a social scientist and economist, and we are not very familiar with your concept, but now we are grasping with them, and we are trying to understand what you're saying about business and business models. And this is extremely important thing. And the last thing is, I wish you will have another opportunity to continue this work and to benefit for us, and thank you very much. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. We've enjoyed it, and thanks everybody on the NRI side and for the translators and everyone who's involved. It's Easter weekend in the UK, and I know for some it's Ramadan going on. So have a good holiday and stay safe.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks, everyone.